Relax and drift to sleep as we explore the essential life skills that somehow never made it into any classroom. Over the next few hours, we'll journey through 100 practical abilities that shape success, relationships, and well-being. Skills that school systems overlook, but that determine how you navigate the real world. From reading body language to managing money, from setting boundaries to learning how to truly listen, these are the tools you wish someone had taught you years ago. Whether you listen all the way through or drift off along the way, you'll discover knowledge that transforms how you approach everyday challenges. Let's begin. Reading body language. Picture this. You're in a job interview, giving perfect answers to every question, but you notice the interviewer's arms are crossed, their eyes keep glancing at the clock, and they're leaning away from you. Despite your words, something's wrong. You can feel it, but you can't quite name it. This ability to read nonverbal communication is one of the most valuable skills humans possess, yet it's rarely taught explicitly. In the 1960s, psychologist Albert Mehrabian conducted research suggesting that in conversations about feelings and attitudes, only 7% of meaning comes from words themselves. The rest comes from tone of voice and body language. While this specific percentage has been debated, the core insight remains. Humans communicate far more through their bodies than their words. Consider a study from 2006, where Princeton researchers showed participants photographs of political candidates for just 1 second. Based solely on facial appearance and body language, participants predicted election outcomes with remarkable accuracy. They weren't analyzing policies or qualifications. They were reading subtle nonverbal cues about confidence, trustworthiness, and competence. This works because humans evolved in small groups where reading intentions was survival critical. Before language, our ancestors needed to detect threats, identify allies, and navigate social hierarchies through observation alone. Your brain processes these signals automatically, registering micro-expressions, posture shifts, and proximity changes before conscious thought catches up. You see this everywhere in modern life. In negotiations, the person who notices when someone's body language contradicts their words gains advantage. In relationships, partners who read each other's nonverbal cues resolve conflicts more effectively. Even in casual social situations, noticing when someone's smile doesn't reach their eyes, when their shoulders tense at a topic, or when they create physical distance tells you what words never will. The truth is, most communication happens in silence. Words are just the surface. The real conversation is happening in how someone holds themselves, where they look, and what they do with their hands. But reading body language is just the beginning. The next skill goes even deeper into human interaction. Setting boundaries. Imagine someone asks you for a favor. It's inconvenient, it'll cost you time you don't have, but you hear yourself saying yes anyway. Later, you're resentful, exhausted, wondering why you can't just say no. This pattern repeats, slowly draining your energy and filling your schedule with obligations you never wanted. The concept of personal boundaries became prominent in psychology during the 1980s, particularly through the work of family therapists like Salvador Minuchin. They observed that healthy families had clear but flexible boundaries, invisible lines that defined where one person ended and another began. Families with poor boundaries, where members couldn't say no or had their space constantly invaded, produced anxious, codependent individuals who struggled in adult relationships. One striking study from the University of Zurich in 2013 found that people who consistently failed to set boundaries showed elevated cortisol levels, the stress hormone, throughout their day. Their bodies were in constant low-level panic because they'd lost control of their own time and energy. Conversely, people who set clear boundaries reported not just lower stress, but higher self-esteem and more satisfying relationships. This works because boundaries aren't walls, they're gates. They don't keep people out, they help you choose what comes in. Your brain needs predictability and control to feel safe. When you can't set limits, when every request becomes an obligation, your nervous system stays in threat mode. But when you establish boundaries, you're signaling to yourself that your needs matter. You see this in workplaces, where people who never say no get overwhelmed while being passed over for promotions because they seem scattered and unreliable. In relationships, partners without boundaries either become resentful martyrs or attract people who exploit their compliance. In families, parents who can't set limits raise children who struggle to self-regulate. The truth is, saying no isn't selfish, it's self-preservation. Every yes to something that drains you is a no to something that matters. And people actually respect boundaries once you start enforcing them. They test them at first, but then they adjust. But knowing you need boundaries and actually implementing them are different skills. The next one addresses how. Assertive communication. Picture this. Your coworker takes credit for your idea in a meeting. You feel angry, violated, but you say nothing. Or maybe you explode, attacking them publicly. Neither response serves you. The first leaves you powerless. The second damages your reputation. There's a third option, one that almost no one teaches. Assertive communication emerged as a defined skill in the 1970s through the work of psychologists Robert Alberti and Michael Emmons. They observed that most people communicate in one of three styles: passive, aggressive, or passive-aggressive. All three created problems. Passive people got walked over. Aggressive people created enemies. Passive-aggressive people destroyed trust. But assertive communication, expressing your needs directly and respectfully, produced better outcomes. The technique was tested extensively in corporate settings. In one study from 1985, managers trained in assertive communication saw team productivity increase by 23% within 6 months. Conflicts decreased, clarity improved, and employees reported feeling more valued. The key was a simple formula. State the situation objectively, express your feeling about it, specify what you need, and explain the positive outcome. This works because assertiveness engages the prefrontal cortex, your rational brain, rather than the amygdala, your emotional reactor. When you communicate assertively, you're choosing your response instead of being hijacked by fight or flight. The other person's defensiveness drops because you're not attacking, you're informing. And you maintain your self-respect because you're advocating for yourself without violating others. In relationships, assertive communication prevents resentment from building. Instead of hinting or expecting your partner to read your mind, you state your needs clearly. In workplaces, assertive employees are seen as confident and reliable, neither pushovers nor troublemakers. In conflicts, assertiveness de-escalates situations that aggression would inflame. But here's the challenge. Assertiveness feels uncomfortable at first, especially if you're conditioned to avoid conflict. Your voice might shake, your heart might race. That discomfort isn't failure, it's growth. Each time you speak up calmly and directly, you're rewiring your neural pathways. And once you can communicate assertively, the next skill multiplies your effectiveness. Emotional regulation. What happens when anger surges through you, hot and overwhelming, demanding immediate expression? You want to lash out, to say the cutting thing, to make the other person feel what you're feeling. In that moment, You're not in control. The emotion is. The science of emotional regulation began in earnest in the 1990s with neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux's research on the amygdala. He discovered that emotional reactions bypass the thinking brain entirely, traveling a low road that triggers response before conscious awareness. This made evolutionary sense. Our ancestors who froze at a rustling bush survived. Those who stopped to think got eaten. But in modern life, this hair-trigger emotional system creates constant problems. Psychologist James Gross at Stanford developed a comprehensive model of emotional regulation in the early 2000s. His research showed that people who could regulate emotions, not suppress them, but modulate their intensity and duration, had better relationships, higher job performance, and significantly better mental health. In one study, participants who practiced a simple technique called cognitive reappraisal, interpreting situations in less threatening ways, showed reduced activity in the amygdala and increased activity in the prefrontal cortex within just 8 weeks. This works because emotions aren't facts. They're signals. They provide information, but they don't have to control behavior. When you feel anger, you're being alerted to a perceived injustice or boundary violation. The anger itself isn't the problem. It's acting on it without thought. Your prefrontal cortex, when engaged, can evaluate whether the threat is real, consider consequences, and choose effective responses. You see this in workplaces where emotional regulation separates leaders from followers. The executive who stays calm under pressure inspires confidence, while the one who explodes creates anxiety. In relationships, partners who can feel angry without becoming cruel build trust over time. In parenting, adults who regulate their emotions raise children who learn to do the same. The truth is, you can't control what you feel, but you can control what you do with those feelings. The space between stimulus and response, that's where your power lives. And that space can be widened through practice. But emotional regulation is internal. The next skill is about navigating the emotions of others. Empathy, without absorption. Imagine sitting with a friend who's devastated by a breakup. They're crying, raw with pain, and you want to help. So you absorb their pain, feel their anguish as if it's yours, and by the end of the conversation, you're emotionally wrecked too. You've confused empathy with merging. The distinction between empathy and emotional absorption was clarified by psychologist Paul Ekman in the 2000s. He studied Buddhist monks and found they could feel others' pain without being overwhelmed by it. They developed what he called compassionate empathy, distinct from empathic distress. The first allows you to understand and respond to suffering. The second drowns you in it, rendering you useless. Research at the Max Planck Institute in 2013 used brain imaging to show the difference. When participants practiced compassionate empathy, their brain's reward centers activated. They felt good helping others. But when they experienced empathic distress, their amygdala lit up, triggering personal stress. Over time, people experiencing chronic empathic distress burned out, becoming cynical and withdrawn, while those practicing compassionate empathy maintained their capacity to help. This works because healthy empathy has boundaries. You understand someone's pain without making it your identity. Your mirror neurons allow you to feel with someone, but your sense of self remains intact. This distinction is crucial. Feeling with someone helps them. Feeling as them helps no one. You see this in healthcare, where nurses practicing compassionate empathy provide better care and avoid burnout, while those absorbing patient suffering leave the profession. In relationships, partners who empathize without merging maintain their own emotional stability while supporting each other. In any helping profession, the ability to care deeply without being consumed determines longevity. The truth is, you can't pour from an empty cup. Absorbing others' emotions until you're depleted doesn't make you a good person. It makes you ineffective. Real empathy maintains enough separateness to actually help. And once you understand this distinction, the next skill becomes essential. Managing mental energy. Picture this. It's 2 p.m. You've been productive all morning, but suddenly your brain feels like sludge. Simple decisions seem impossible. You can't focus. You're not physically tired, but mentally, you're empty. You didn't know mental energy was finite, and now you've run out. The concept of mental energy, or ego depletion, was introduced by psychologist Roy Baumeister in 1998. His research showed that willpower and decision-making draw from a limited pool of mental resources. In his famous cookie and radish experiment, participants who had to resist eating cookies gave up on a subsequent difficult puzzle much faster than those who hadn't been forced to exercise self-control. Every decision, every temptation resisted, every focus shift drained this resource. Later research complicated the picture. A 2010 study found that ego depletion could be overcome by motivation or glucose. Your mental energy isn't just a battery that depletes linearly. It's influenced by what you believe about willpower, what matters to you, and even your blood sugar levels. But the core insight remained. Mental energy is real and manageable. This works because your prefrontal cortex, responsible for complex thinking and self-control, is metabolically expensive. It requires significant glucose and oxygen. When you've used it intensively, making decisions, resisting impulses, focusing on difficult tasks, it becomes less efficient. This isn't laziness, it's biology. You see this in workplaces, where important decisions scheduled for late afternoon go poorly because executives are mentally drained. In personal life, people make their worst choices at night after a day of exercising willpower. In relationships, fights often happen when both partners are mentally depleted and can't regulate effectively. The truth is, you have more mental energy in the morning for most people than evening. Protecting that energy, using it for what matters most, is a skill. That means making important decisions early, automating trivial choices, and understanding that by 8 p.m., your judgment is compromised. But managing your own mental energy is one thing. Understanding how your physical state affects your mind is another. The body-mind connection. What happens when you've been sitting for hours, hunched over a computer, breathing shallowly, and you notice your anxiety rising? You assume the anxiety is about work, about deadlines, but you've forgotten that your body shapes your mental state more than you realize. The connection between physical posture and psychological state was demonstrated dramatically by Dana Carney and Amy Cuddy in 2010 with their research on power poses. They found that holding an expansive posture for just 2 minutes increased testosterone, decreased cortisol, and made people feel more powerful. While the hormonal findings faced replication issues, the psychological effects remained robust. Changing your body changes your mind. Earlier research from the 1980s by James Pennebaker showed that even writing about emotional experiences improved physical health. People who wrote about trauma had stronger immune function, fewer doctor visits, and faster wound healing. The connection wasn't just mind affecting body, but body and mind as one integrated system. This works because your brain doesn't just command your body, it constantly receives feedback from it. Proprioceptors in your muscles send signals about posture. Your vagus nerve communicates gut states to your brain. Your breathing rate directly influences your nervous system. When you sit in a collapsed posture, breathing shallowly, your brain interprets these signals as defeat or threat, generating corresponding emotions. You see this in therapy, where somatic practices, addressing the body, release emotions that talk therapy couldn't touch. In sports psychology, where athletes learn that changing physical state before competition changes mental state. In everyday life, where a short walk can shift your entire mood, not through distraction, but through changing the signals your body sends your brain. The truth is, you don't have a body and a mind. You have one system. When you neglect your body, sitting all day, breathing poorly, skipping movement, you're not just harming your physical health, you're degrading your mental functioning. And once you understand this connection, the next skill becomes obvious. Strategic rest. Imagine believing that productivity means constant work, that breaks are weakness, that rest is something you earn only after you've pushed yourself to exhaustion. You wear your sleep deprivation like a badge of honor, your inability to relax as proof of dedication. Then one day, your body stops cooperating. The science of rest underwent a revolution in the 1990s when chronobiologist William Dement's research on sleep demonstrated that sleep deprivation had the same cognitive impairment as intoxication. Being awake for 17 hours produced the same performance as a blood alcohol level of 0.05%. Yet society still celebrated the sleep when you're dead mentality. More recently, research on ultradian rhythms by Anders Ericsson revealed that elite performers, whether musicians, athletes, or chess players, don't work longer hours than average performers. They rest more strategically. They work in focused 90-minute blocks, then take complete breaks. Their total practice time might be less, but their effectiveness was dramatically higher. This works because your brain has natural cycles. It can't maintain peak focus continuously. After about 90 minutes of concentrated work, your prefrontal cortex needs recovery. If you push through, quality plummets, even if you're working. But if you rest strategically, 10 to 20 minutes of genuine disengagement, your brain consolidates learning, processes information, and restores its capacity. You see this in corporate cultures, where long hours correlate with poor outcomes. Exhausted employees make mistakes, miss insights, and create problems that rested minds would have avoided. In creative fields, the best ideas arrive during rest, not grinding. In personal life, chronic busyness becomes a way to avoid reflection, but it produces shallow engagement with everything. The truth is, rest isn't the absence of work, it's what makes work effective. Your brain needs oscillation, intensity followed by recovery. Without it, you're not being productive, you're just busy. But physical rest is only one kind. The next skill addresses another crucial form. Mental decluttering. Picture this. You have 47 browser tabs open, 2,000 unread emails, 3 unfinished projects, and 5 streaming shows you're watching simultaneously. Nothing gets your complete attention. Your mind mirrors this chaos, jumping between tasks, never settling, always slightly anxious. The cognitive cost of clutter was quantified by neuroscientists at Princeton in 2011. They used fMRI to measure brain activity, while people viewed organized versus cluttered environments. Cluttered spaces produced measurably higher stress, reduced ability to focus, and decreased information processing. The visual cortex got overwhelmed by competing stimuli, draining resources needed for actual thinking. This physical clutter mirrors mental clutter. Psychologist Zygarnik discovered in the 1920s that unfinished tasks occupy mental RAM, the Zygarnik effect. Your brain keeps these incomplete items active, draining energy even when you're not consciously thinking about them. In a 2011 study, participants who wrote down their uncompleted goals stopped obsessing about them, freeing mental resources. This works because your working memory is limited. When it's cluttered with open loops, unfinished tasks, environmental chaos, and digital noise, there's no capacity left for deep thinking. Your prefrontal cortex is constantly task switching, and every switch costs energy and performance. You see this in workplaces, where open offices with constant distraction produce measurably worse outcomes than quiet spaces. In homes, where physical clutter correlates with elevated cortisol and reduced well-being. In digital life, where notification-driven existence prevents the sustained attention required for meaningful work. The truth is, your environment shapes your mind. A cluttered environment creates a cluttered mind. Simplifying your external world, closing loops, organizing physical space isn't superficial. It's cognitive hygiene. And once your mental space is clear, the next skill helps you fill it wisely. Information. Diet. What happens when you consume information constantly? Scrolling news, checking social media, absorbing others' opinions, but never stopping to think. Your mind becomes a repository of other people's thoughts, with no room for your own. The concept of information overload was identified by Alvin Toffler in 1970 with his book Future Shock. But it's become exponentially worse. A 2011 study from the University of California found that Americans consumed about 34 gigabytes of information daily, the equivalent of reading 174 newspapers. The human brain didn't evolve for this volume. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin's research in the 2010s showed that constant information consumption prevents the default mode network from activating. This network, active during rest and mind wandering, is crucial for insight, creativity, and processing experiences. People who never disconnect never activate this network, preventing deep thinking. This works because learning requires 3 stages: input, processing, and consolidation. Modern life provides constant input, but no processing or consolidation. Information enters but never integrates. You consume but don't digest. The result is the illusion of knowledge without actual understanding. You see this in students who highlight entire textbooks but can't answer questions because they never stop to think. In professionals who attend every webinar and read every article but can't apply any of it. In people who know the news but can't articulate their own positions. The truth is, information isn't knowledge. Consuming more doesn't make you smarter. It just makes you busy. An information diet, deliberately limiting input and creating space for thinking, is as important as a food diet. But controlling information input is one thing. The next skill is about output. Constructive self-talk. Picture this. You make a mistake, and immediately a voice in your head says, "You're so stupid. You always mess things up. You'll never get this right." This voice is so familiar you don't question it, but it's been shaping your reality for years. The study of self-talk began formally in the 1960s with Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, founders of cognitive therapy. They discovered that depression and anxiety weren't caused by events themselves, but by how people interpreted events through internal dialogue. Changing self-talk changed emotional experience. In the 1980s, sports psychologists adopted these insights. They found that athletes' self-talk before and during competition dramatically affected performance. Negative self-talk created a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure, but constructive self-talk, not empty positivity, but realistic and encouraging, improved outcomes. This works because self-talk activates the same neural pathways as external speech. When you tell yourself you're incompetent, your brain processes it as external information. generating corresponding emotions and behaviors. Over time, negative self-talk creates neural pathways that become default patterns. You see this in people who constantly demean themselves, eventually becoming what they repeatedly say they are. In students whose internal dialogue about being bad at math creates anxiety that prevents learning, in anyone whose self-talk has become a bully they can't escape. The truth is, you wouldn't speak to others the way you speak to yourself. That voice in your head isn't objective truth, it's learned pattern. And patterns can be changed. But changing self-talk requires awareness. The next skill provides that. Metacognition. What happens when you're thinking, but you're also aware that you're thinking? You notice your thought processes, recognize patterns, catch yourself making assumptions. This thinking about thinking is rarer than you'd imagine. The formal study of metacognition began with developmental psychologist John Flavel in the 1970s. He observed that children gradually develop the ability to monitor and control their own thinking processes. But many adults never fully develop this skill, remaining unconscious of their own mental patterns. Research and education showed that students who practiced metacognition, pausing to assess their understanding, identifying what they knew and didn't know, performed dramatically better than those who just studied. A 2008 meta-analysis found that metacognitive training improved academic performance across all subjects. This works because metacognition creates distance between you and your thoughts. Instead of being swept along by thought streams, you observe them. This observer position activates the prefrontal cortex, allowing you to evaluate whether your thoughts are accurate, helpful, or distorted. You see this in therapy, where metacognitive awareness allows people to recognize depressive thought patterns as patterns, not truth. In decision-making, where noticing your own biases reduces their influence. In learning, where self-awareness about comprehension drives better strategies. The truth is, most people don't think about their thinking. They're lost in thought, assuming their mental processes are reality. Metacognition is waking up from that trance. And once you're aware of your thinking, the next skill refines it. Critical thinking. Imagine reading an article that confirms everything you already believe. It feels good, so you share it without questioning its sources, checking its claims, or considering alternative interpretations. You've just failed to think critically. Critical thinking as a defined skill emerged from philosophy, but was formalized as an educational goal in the mid-20th century. In 1941, educator Edward Glaser wrote that critical thinking involved attitudes of inquiry, knowledge of methods of logical inquiry, and skill in applying those methods. Yet decades later, studies consistently show most people lack these skills. A landmark 2011 study by Richard Arum and Josipa Roxa found that 45% of college students showed no improvement in critical thinking after 2 years of education. They could memorize and regurgitate, but they couldn't analyze arguments, identify assumptions, or evaluate evidence. This works because critical thinking isn't natural, it's cultivated. Your brain prefers efficiency over accuracy, relying on heuristics and confirmation bias. Critical thinking requires deliberately overriding these defaults, questioning comfortable conclusions, and tolerating uncertainty. You see this in political polarization, where people accept claims uncritically if they align with their tribe. In consumer behavior, where marketing exploits the absence of critical analysis. In every domain where belief precedes investigation. The truth is, being smart isn't the same as thinking critically. Intelligent people can be terrible thinkers if they've never learned to question assumptions, trace logical implications, or demand evidence. But critical thinking about information is one thing. The next skill is about critical thinking about yourself. Recognizing cognitive biases. Picture this. You're certain you predicted something after it happened. You remember thinking it would turn out exactly this way, except you didn't. You've just experienced hindsight bias, the feeling that past events were more predictable than they actually were. The systematic study of cognitive biases began with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the 1970s. They demonstrated that human reasoning consistently deviates from rationality in predictable ways. These weren't random errors, they were systematic patterns. In 2002, Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for this work, fundamentally changing how we understand human judgment. One of their most famous experiments, the Linda problem, showed how powerfully bias operates. Participants were told Linda was a philosophy major, concerned with discrimination and social justice. Then asked which was more likely. Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. Most chose the second, violating basic probability because the detailed description felt more representative, even though it's mathematically impossible for the second to be more likely. This works because your brain evolved for speed, not accuracy. In ancestral environments, quick judgments about threats and opportunities were more valuable than perfect logic. Modern life requires different thinking, but you're still running ancient software. Biases are features, not bugs. They're efficient shortcuts. But efficiency produces errors. You see this everywhere. In investing, where confirmation bias leads people to seek information supporting their positions. In relationships, where fundamental attribution error makes you blame your partner's character for behavior you'd attribute to circumstances in yourself. In every domain where your brain's shortcuts undermine your goals. The truth is, you can't eliminate cognitive biases, but you can recognize them. Awareness doesn't make you immune, but it does make you cautious when stakes are high. And recognizing your biases is foundational for the next skill. Decision-making frameworks. What happens when you face an important decision, but you approach it the same way you choose what to eat for lunch? You go with your gut. You overthink. You ask everyone's opinion. You change your mind repeatedly. No systematic process, just hoping you'll somehow arrive at the right answer. The study of decision-making was revolutionized by Herbert Simon in the 1950s with his concept of bounded rationality. He argued that humans don't optimize decisions. They satisfice, choosing the first option that meets minimum criteria. This isn't laziness. It's necessary, given limited time and information. Later research distinguished between decisions types. In his 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman described System 1, fast intuitive thinking, and System 2, slow analytical thinking. Most decisions use System 1, which is efficient but error-prone. Important decisions require forcing System 2 engagement. This works because different decisions require different approaches. Reversible decisions with low stakes, what to eat, can be made quickly. Irreversible decisions with high stakes, career changes, major purchases, need frameworks. Without frameworks, people either decide too quickly, trusting flawed intuitions, or analyze forever, paralyzed by overthinking. You see this in business, where frameworks like cost-benefit analysis, decision matrices, and premortems improve outcomes. In personal life, where people who write down decision criteria before evaluating options make choices they're happier with. In any high-stakes situation, where systematic thinking outperforms gut instinct. The truth is, How you decide matters as much as what you decide. A good process produces better outcomes over time, even if individual decisions still fail. But decision-making frameworks help you choose. The next skill helps you act. Overcoming analysis. Paralysis. Imagine having all the information you need, understanding the options clearly, but still unable to choose. You keep researching, seeking one more opinion, waiting for certainty that never comes. Meanwhile, the opportunity closes or the decision becomes irrelevant. The term analysis paralysis emerged in the 1990s, but the phenomenon was studied earlier. In a famous 2000 experiment by Sheena Iyengar, the JAM study, researchers set up tasting booths. One offered 24 jam varieties, another offered 6. The extensive selection attracted more initial interest, but only 3% of people who stopped bought anything. At the limited selection booth, 30% made purchases. Too many options created paralysis. Barry Schwartz expanded this in his 2004 book, The Paradox of Choice, arguing that excessive options don't increase satisfaction, they decrease it. Even when people eventually choose, they're less happy because they can imagine all the alternatives they're missing. This works because decision-making depletes mental energy. Each option you evaluate costs resources. With too many options, you either give up or make a worse choice because you're mentally exhausted. Additionally, your brain seeks certainty, but certainty is impossible in complex decisions. Waiting for it means never acting. You see this in careers, where people research opportunities endlessly but never commit. In relationships, where fear of choosing wrong keeps people perpetually dating. In any domain where perfectionism masquerades as thoroughness. The truth is, most decisions are reversible or correctable. The cost of not deciding often exceeds the cost of deciding wrong. Action provides information that analysis never can. But taking action requires overcoming another obstacle. The next skill addresses it. Managing fear of failure. Picture this. You have an idea, a project you're excited about, but you don't start. Not because you lack time or resources, but because you might fail. Better not to try than to try and confirm your inadequacy. This fear, so reasonable sounding, keeps you frozen. The psychology of failure avoidance was studied extensively in the 1960s by John Atkinson, who distinguished between achievement motivation and failure avoidance. Some people are driven by the possibility of success, others by the need to avoid failure. The second group plays it safe, choosing tasks that are either very easy, guaranteeing success, or impossibly hard, making failure meaningless. Carol Dweck's research in the 2000s on growth mindset refined this understanding. She found that people with fixed mindsets, believing ability is innate and unchangeable, see failure as evidence of their limitations. People with growth mindsets see failure as information, evidence of where they need to improve. This works because fear of failure isn't really about the failure itself. It's about what failure means to your self-image. If your identity depends on being competent, then failure threatens your sense of self. But if your identity is as someone who learns and grows, failure becomes data. You see this in education, where students who fear failure choose easier courses and learn less. In entrepreneurship, where fear of failure prevents people from starting businesses that might succeed. In any domain where potential regret about trying outweighs actual regret about not trying, which it almost never does. The truth is, everyone fears failure. The difference is in how you relate to that fear. Do you let it veto action, or do you act despite it? But managing fear requires understanding its source. The next skill provides that understanding. Identifying limiting beliefs. What happens when you constantly think, I'm not good with money, I'm terrible at math, or I'm just an anxious person? These statements feel like objective observations, but they're beliefs, and beliefs shape reality through your actions. The concept of limiting beliefs became prominent through cognitive therapy in the 1970s and was later adopted by the self-help movement. While sometimes oversimplified, the core insight remains valid. Unconscious beliefs constrain behavior. If you believe you can't do something, you won't try, and the belief becomes self-fulfilling. Psychologist Carol Dweck's work showed this dramatically with children. In her experiments, children praised for intelligence, "You're so smart," developed limiting beliefs. When they encountered difficult problems, they gave up quickly because failure threatened their identity as smart. Children praised for effort, "You worked really hard," persisted longer because difficulty didn't threaten their self-concept. This works because beliefs act as filters. You notice information confirming your beliefs and dismiss contradicting information. If you believe you're bad with people, you'll remember every awkward interaction and forget every smooth one. Your belief creates selective attention that reinforces itself. You see this in people who remain in the same patterns for decades because they've identified with those patterns. The person who's always been bad with money makes different financial decisions than someone who sees themselves as learning financial skills. The belief determines the behavior. The truth is, many of your limitations aren't real. They're believed. And the first step to changing them is recognizing they exist. But recognizing limiting beliefs is just the start. Changing them requires the next skill. Reframing. Negative experiences. Picture this. You didn't get the job you wanted. You can tell yourself, "I'm not good enough. I'll never succeed." Or you can tell yourself, "That wasn't the right fit. I learned what to improve for next time." Same situation, completely different meanings, completely different outcomes. The technique of cognitive reframing was developed by psychologist Aaron Beck in the 1960s as part of cognitive therapy. He observed that depressed patients didn't just have sad feelings. They had distorted thinking patterns. They interpreted neutral or even positive events negatively, teaching them to reframe, to find alternative interpretations, reduce depression as effectively as medication in many cases. A powerful demonstration came from research on trauma survivors. Psychologist James Pennebaker in the 1980s had participants write about traumatic experiences, but with a twist. Some were asked to find meaning or growth in the trauma. Those who reframed their experiences, not denying the pain, but finding some positive aspect, showed better physical health, fewer doctor visits, and stronger immune function months later. This works because the meaning you assign to events matters more than the events themselves. Two people experience the same setback. One sees it as confirmation of unworthiness, spiraling into depression. The other sees it as redirection, maintaining motivation. The external reality is identical. The internal interpretation creates divergent paths. You see this in successful people who describe failures as their best teachers, in resilient individuals who faced tragedy but found purpose through it, in anyone who's discovered that how you frame experience determines what you extract from it. The truth is, you can't always control what happens to you, but you can control the story you tell about it. And that story becomes your reality. But reframing requires awareness of automatic thoughts. The next skill develops that awareness. Thought stopping. What happens when a negative thought loops endlessly in your mind? I'm going to fail. Everyone will judge me. I can't handle this. The thought spins, gaining momentum, pulling you into anxiety or despair. You're trapped in a mental spiral. The technique of thought stopping was introduced by psychologist Joseph Wolpe in the 1950s as a behavioral intervention. Initially, it involved literally shouting "stop" when unwanted thoughts arose, interrupting the pattern. Later refinements made it more subtle, using mental interruption rather than verbal. Research in the 1970s and 80s showed mixed results. Thought stopping alone wasn't enough. Suppressing thoughts often made them rebound stronger, the white bear effect. But when combined with thought replacement, substituting constructive thoughts for destructive ones, it became effective. A 1987 study found that thought stopping plus replacement reduced intrusive thoughts by 60% within 4 weeks. This works because rumination, repetitive negative thinking, creates neural pathways. Each time you rehearse a thought, you strengthen its connection. Thought stopping interrupts this rehearsal before the pathway deepens. But you can't leave a vacuum. That's why replacement is crucial. Your mind needs something to think instead. You see this in anxiety disorders, where catastrophic thoughts loop without interruption. In depression, where rumination deepens the mood. In anyone who's discovered that letting negative thoughts run unchallenged makes them feel true. The truth is, you don't have to believe every thought your mind produces. Thoughts are mental events, not facts. And you can learn to interrupt destructive patterns before they take hold. But stopping negative thoughts is defensive. The next skill is offensive. Deliberate optimism. Imagine choosing to look for what's working rather than what's broken, focusing on possibilities rather than limitations, interpreting ambiguous situations favorably rather than negatively. Not because you're naive, but because you've learned optimism produces better outcomes. The scientific study of optimism was pioneered by Martin Seligman in the 1990s with his concept of learned optimism. Through decades of research, he found that optimistic people, those who attributed setbacks to specific, temporary, external causes rather than personal, permanent, internal ones, experience better health, higher achievement, and greater resilience. A landmark study tracked insurance salespeople, a field with high rejection rates. Optimistic salespeople outsold pessimistic ones by 37% and were half as likely to quit within the first year. The difference wasn't talent or training, it was how they interpreted rejection. Optimists saw it as situational. That person wasn't a good fit, while pessimists saw it as personal. I'm bad at this. This works because optimism isn't about denying reality. It's about interpreting ambiguity favorably. Most situations are ambiguous. They could mean multiple things. Pessimists default to negative interpretations, which creates negative emotions, which drives avoidant behavior, which produces poor outcomes. Optimists default to constructive interpretations, maintaining motivation and persistence. You see this in entrepreneurship, where optimism predicts success better than intelligence. In health, where optimistic cardiac patients recover faster than pessimistic ones with identical medical conditions. In any long-term endeavor where setbacks are inevitable, an interpretation determines whether you continue. The truth is, pessimism feels realistic, but it's actually a bias. Reality is complex, containing both positive and negative elements. Choosing to focus on the positive isn't delusion, it's strategic. But optimism about external circumstances is one thing. The next skill addresses optimism about yourself. Building self-efficacy. Picture this. You face a challenge, something you've never done before, and you immediately think, I can't do this. Not, I don't know how yet, but I can't. That belief, more than any external obstacle, determines your outcome. Self-efficacy, the belief in your capacity to achieve goals, was defined by psychologist Albert Bandura in 1977. Through extensive research, he found that self-efficacy predicted success better than actual skill level. People with high self-efficacy attempt more, persist longer, and recover faster from setbacks. People with low self-efficacy give up quickly, even when they're capable. Bandura identified 4 sources of self-efficacy. The most powerful is mastery experience. Successfully completing tasks builds belief. Second is vicarious experience, seeing similar others succeed. Third is social persuasion, encouragement from credible sources. Fourth is interpreting physiological states. Anxiety can be seen as excitement rather than inability. This works because self-efficacy becomes self-fulfilling. If you believe you can learn something, you try harder, persist longer, and use better strategies, increasing your chance of success. If you believe you can't, you don't try, give up quickly, and use poor strategies, ensuring failure. The belief shapes the outcome. You see this in education, where students with higher self-efficacy learn faster, not because they're smarter, but because they engage more. In careers, where self-efficacy about specific skills predicts performance better than IQ. In any domain where belief in capability precedes actual capability. The truth is, confidence isn't arrogance or delusion. It's the foundation of competence. You build it through small successes, each one strengthening your belief that you can handle challenges. But self-efficacy is about specific skills. The next concept is broader. Developing self-reliance. What happens when you constantly seek external validation, asking others what you should do, needing approval for every decision, outsourcing your judgment to anyone who'll give an opinion? You become dependent, unable to trust yourself, perpetually uncertain. The concept of self-reliance as a psychological skill was articulated by philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1841, though his version was more spiritual than psychological. Modern psychology approached it through attachment theory and autonomy research. In the 1970s, Edward Deci and Richard Ryan's self-determination theory identified autonomy as a fundamental human need, essential for well-being. Research consistently shows that autonomous people, those who make decisions based on internal values rather than external pressure, report higher life satisfaction, less anxiety, and greater achievement. A 2008 study found that teenagers with higher autonomy were less susceptible to peer pressure and made better long-term decisions. This works because when you rely on external validation, you're never satisfied. You achieve something, get praised, feel briefly good, then need more praise. The validation is temporary because it's external. But when you develop internal standards, when you can assess your own performance and decide your own direction, you become stable. You see this in people who change careers constantly, seeking the perfect job that someone else will validate. In relationships, where people need constant reassurance. In anyone who's lost touch with their own values and preferences, outsourcing their identity to others. The truth is, self-reliance doesn't mean isolation or refusing help. It means having a core sense of self that isn't dependent on others' opinions. You can consider advice without needing permission. You can receive feedback without being destabilized. But self-reliance requires knowing what you value. The next skill addresses that. Clarifying values. Imagine living your entire life according to values you never chose, pursuing goals that aren't yours, meeting expectations you never agreed to. You're successful by external measures, but feel empty because nothing you're doing matters to you. The importance of values clarification was highlighted by psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps. In his 1946 book, Man's Search for Meaning, he argued that having purpose and values made the difference between those who survived and those who didn't. Later, acceptance and commitment therapy formalized values work as a therapeutic tool in the 1990s. Research shows that people who can articulate their core values make better decisions, experience less regret, and report higher life satisfaction. A 2005 study found that writing about personal values before stressful events, like exams, reduced stress and improved performance. Simply reconnecting with what matters provided psychological strength. This works because values act as a compass. When you're unclear about values, every decision becomes difficult because you have no criteria. Should you take this job? Depends on whether you value security, creativity, impact, or income, and you haven't decided. But with clear values, decisions become easier. Options either align with what matters or they don't. You see this in midlife crises, where people realize they've been living someone else's values, usually parents or societies, and feel the need to start over. In career dissatisfaction, where high-paying jobs feel meaningless because they don't align with values. In any situation where success by external standards produces internal emptiness. The truth is, you can't live a meaningful life without knowing what's meaningful to you. And that requires deliberate reflection, not just accepting inherited values. But knowing your values is one thing. The next skill is about living them. Aligned action. Picture this. You value health, but you don't exercise. You value family, but you work 80-hour weeks. You value creativity, but you spend evenings scrolling social media. There's a gap between what you say matters and how you actually live. The concept of value-action alignment became central to acceptance and commitment therapy in the 1990s. Psychologist Stephen Hayes found that psychological distress often stemmed from this misalignment, living in ways that contradicted core values. Depression wasn't just sadness, it was the pain of betraying yourself. Research by psychologist Roy Baumeister in the 2000s found that people who acted consistently with their values experienced greater meaning in life, even when those actions were difficult. Alignment, not comfort, produced well-being. A 2012 study showed that simply tracking how daily activities aligned with stated values increased life satisfaction within 2 weeks. This works because misalignment creates cognitive dissonance, psychological discomfort from holding contradictory beliefs and behaviors. You believe family matters, but you're never home. This inconsistency generates guilt, shame, and rationalization. But when actions align with values, even difficult actions feel right. You see this in people who quit high-paying jobs to do meaningful work at lower pay and report being happier. In parents who sacrifice career advancement to be present and don't regret it. In anyone who's discovered that integrity, internal consistency, matters more than external success. The truth is, you can't think your way into feeling fulfilled. You have to act. And when your actions reflect your values, life starts feeling like yours. But aligned action requires time. The next skill is about protecting it. Time management. As priority, management. What happens when you're busy all day but accomplish nothing important? You respond to every email, attend every meeting, handle every request, but the work that actually matters, the projects that align with your goals, never gets done. The modern understanding of time management shifted in the 1990s from efficiency to effectiveness. Stephen Covey's 1989 book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, introduced the time management matrix, distinguishing between urgent and important. He found that people spend most time on urgent tasks, whether important or not, neglecting important but non-urgent activities that create long-term value. Research by productivity expert Cal Newport in the 2010s showed that knowledge workers are interrupted every 3 to 5 minutes on average. These constant interruptions, even brief ones, fragment attention and destroy deep work capacity. A 2013 study found that it takes an average of 23 minutes to fully recover focus after an interruption. This works because time is finite, but demands are infinite. You can't do everything, so time management is really priority management. If you don't consciously choose what matters, urgency will choose for you, and urgency rarely aligns with importance. You see this in professionals who are always busy but never advance because they're doing everyone else's priorities. In students who study constantly but perform poorly because they never study what's actually important. In anyone who's discovered that being busy isn't the same as being effective. The truth is, time management isn't about doing more things. It's about doing the right things. And that requires the courage to say no to urgent but unimportant demands. But managing time requires knowing how you actually spend it. The next skill provides that awareness. Time tracking. Imagine asking someone how they spend their time, and they tell you. Then you track their actual behavior, and it's completely different. They genuinely believe they work 60 hours a week, but tracking shows 40. They think they spend an hour daily on social media, tracking shows 4. The disconnect between perceived and actual time use was demonstrated dramatically by researcher Laura Vanderkam. In her 2010 study of high-achieving women, she had participants estimate their weekly hours, then track them precisely. The estimates were consistently wrong, often by 10-20 hours. People didn't lie. They genuinely didn't know how they spent time. Research from Rescue Time, a time tracking company, found that people estimate they're productive about 50% of the workday. Actual tracking shows 12.5%. The gap isn't laziness, it's unawareness. Time passes unnoticed, consumed by invisible activities. This works because time is invisible and subjective. An hour can feel like minutes or feel like forever, depending on what you're doing. Without measurement, you're operating on feeling, and feeling is wildly inaccurate. But once you track, you see reality, often disturbing reality. You see this when people claim they have no time for exercise, but track and discover they spend 2 hours nightly watching TV. Or say they're too busy for important projects, but track and find hours consumed by email and meetings. Awareness changes behavior because you can't ignore measured reality. The truth is, you can't manage what you don't measure. Tracking time isn't about judgment, it's about information. Once you know where time goes, you can redirect it. But time isn't the only resource that needs tracking. The next skill addresses another. Managing energy, not just time. Picture this. You have a completely free day, 8 uninterrupted hours, but by noon, you're exhausted. You have time, but you've run out of energy. Time management alone doesn't solve this. The concept of energy management was popularized by Jim Lohr and Tony Schwartz in their 2003 book, The Power of Full Engagement. They argued that managing energy, not time, is the key to high performance. You can have all the time in the world, but without energy, you can't use it effectively. They identified 4 types of energy: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. Physical energy comes from sleep, nutrition, and movement. Emotional energy from positive relationships and emotional regulation. Mental energy from focus and recovery. Spiritual energy from meaning and purpose. All four need management. This works because humans aren't machines that operate at constant capacity. You have natural rhythms, cycles of high and low energy throughout the day. Working against these rhythms, pushing through low energy periods, produces diminishing returns. But aligning important work with high energy periods maximizes effectiveness. You see this in people who schedule creative work for their peak energy times, usually morning for most people, and administrative tasks for low energy times. In athletes who train hard, then recover hard, understanding that recovery isn't weakness, it's part of the process. In anyone who's learned that pushing through exhaustion is less productive than resting and returning fresh. The truth is, you have limited energy, and unlike time, it can be replenished. Managing energy means knowing what drains you, what replenishes you, and protecting your energy for what matters most. But managing your own energy is one thing. The next skill is about understanding others' energy. Reading social dynamics. What happens when you walk into a room and immediately sense the tension between two people, even though they're smiling and no one said anything? Or you notice that someone's being excluded from the group, subtly shut out of conversations? You're reading social dynamics, invisible patterns that shape every interaction. The study of social dynamics was formalized by sociologist Irving Goffman in the 1950s and 60s. He analyzed human interaction as performance, with people playing roles, maintaining face, and navigating unspoken rules. His work revealed that every social situation has hidden structure, and those who can't read it stumble constantly. Research on social intelligence by psychologist Daniel Goleman in the 1990s showed that the ability to read social dynamics predicted success better than IQ in many contexts. Leaders who could sense group tensions, identify power structures, and understand unspoken alliances were more effective than those focused solely on tasks. This works because humans are intensely social, and groups have complex dynamics. There are hierarchies, even in supposedly flat organizations. There are alliances, coalitions, and conflicts. There are unspoken rules about who can speak, whose opinions matter, and what topics are acceptable. Missing these patterns is like being socially blind. You see this in people who are technically competent but never advance because they don't understand organizational politics. In friendships, where someone consistently misses social cues, making situations uncomfortable. In any group, where some people effortlessly navigate dynamics while others constantly create friction. The truth is, social dynamics are real, even when invisible. Pretending they don't exist doesn't make you principled. It makes you ineffective. Reading these patterns allows you to navigate them skillfully. But reading dynamics is one thing. The next skill is about influencing them. Building social capital. Imagine needing help, a job reference, an introduction, advice from an expert, and having a network of people willing to help you. Not because you're manipulating them, but because you've built genuine relationships over time. This network, this social capital, is one of life's most valuable assets. The concept of social capital was developed by sociologist Robert Putnam in the 1990s. He argued that social networks have value, just like financial capital. People with strong social capital, diverse connections built on trust and reciprocity, had access to opportunities, information, and support that isolated individuals lacked. Research consistently shows that social capital predicts success across domains. A landmark 1973 study by sociologist Mark Granovetter found that most jobs come through weak ties. acquaintances rather than close friends. Your close network knows what you know, but weak ties connect you to different information and opportunities. A 2012 study found that entrepreneurs with diverse social capital were 3 times more likely to succeed. This works because humans are tribal. They help those they know and trust. Having social capital means people know you, remember you positively, and feel some connection. When opportunity arises, they think of you. Without social capital, you're invisible, no matter how talented. You see this in careers, where 2 equally qualified people apply for a position, but one knows someone in the company and gets hired. In business, where deals happen through relationships, not cold pitches. In every domain, where access and opportunity flow through networks. The truth is, building social capital isn't manipulation. It's investing in relationships. You help people without expecting immediate return. You stay in touch. You show up. Over time, this creates a web of mutual support. But building social capital requires genuine connection. The next skill enables that. Asking better questions. Picture this. Someone tells you about their weekend, and you respond, "That's nice." Then change the subject to your weekend. Or you ask a yes or no question that kills the conversation. You think you're engaging, but you're actually shutting down connection. The art of questioning was studied formally in education and therapy, but applies universally. In the 1950s, educator Benjamin Bloom created a taxonomy of questions, from simple recall to complex analysis. He showed that quality shapes, thinking quality. Deep questions produce deep thought. Shallow questions produce shallow responses. Journalist Warren Berger's 2014 book, A More Beautiful Question, documented how innovative thinkers use questions differently. Instead of seeking quick answers, they ask why multiple times, exploring assumptions. They ask, what if, to imagine alternatives. They ask, how might we, to generate solutions. The questions themselves drive discovery. This works because questions direct attention. A bad question, "Did you have a good day?" gets a one-word answer. A better question, "What was the most interesting part of your day?" invites storytelling. The best questions reveal what the person cares about, thinks about, and struggles with, creating genuine connection. You see this in therapy, where skilled questions help clients discover insights they didn't know they had. In journalism, where great interviews come from great questions. In any conversation, where depth of connection correlates with quality of questions. The truth is, most people wait to talk rather than seeking to understand. But those who ask genuine questions, who are actually curious about others, build relationships that others can't. But asking questions is about understanding others. The next skill is about expressing yourself. Storytelling. What happens when you have important information to share, but you present it as dry facts and data? People's eyes glaze over. They forget it immediately. But if you tell a story, suddenly they're engaged. They remember, and more importantly, they care. The power of storytelling in human cognition was documented by psychologist Jerome Bruner in the 1980s. He found that people are 22 times more likely to remember information presented in story form than as facts. Stories activate multiple brain regions, creating stronger memories and emotional connections. Neuroscientist Paul Zach's research in the 2010s showed that compelling stories trigger oxytocin release, the bonding hormone. When you hear a good story, your brain doesn't just process information, it simulates the experience. Mirror neurons fire as if you're living the story yourself. This creates empathy and connection that facts alone never achieve. This works because humans evolved as storytellers. Before writing, knowledge was preserved and transmitted through stories. Your brain is wired to encode experience as narrative with characters, conflicts, and resolutions. Information that fits this structure processes more easily and remembers better. You see this in business, where leaders who tell compelling stories inspire action, while those who cite data produce reports that get ignored. In teaching, where students remember the teacher's examples and stories, not the definitions. In any situation where you need to influence, persuade, or connect. The truth is, facts tell, but stories sell. Not because stories are manipulative, but because they're how human brains actually work. Learning to communicate through story isn't a nice skill. It's essential. But storytelling is about sharing experiences. The next skill is about having experiences worth sharing. Cultivating curiosity. Imagine going through life seeing everything as ordinary, familiar, already understood. You've stopped asking questions, stopped wondering, stopped being surprised. You're not living. You're just existing, moving through days on autopilot. The importance of curiosity was highlighted by psychologist Todd Kashdan in the 2000s. His research showed that curious people report higher life satisfaction, better relationships, and greater personal growth. They're not smarter or more talented, they're simply more engaged with life. A landmark 2014 study from the University of California used fMRI to show that curiosity activates the brain's reward system, releasing dopamine. When people were curious about an answer, they were more likely to remember both the answer and incidental information learned at the same time. Curiosity doesn't just motivate learning, it enhances memory. This works because curiosity is an appetite for information. Just as hunger drives you to seek food, curiosity drives you to seek knowledge and experience. Without it, life becomes routine. With it, even ordinary moments contain discovery. You see this in children who are endlessly curious, asking why, constantly, exploring everything. Most adults lose this, becoming certain they already understand how things work. But people who maintain curiosity continue learning, adapting, and finding life interesting throughout their lives. The truth is, curiosity isn't just about acquiring information, it's about maintaining engagement with existence. Curious people don't get bored because everything is potentially interesting. But curiosity requires openness. The next skill develops that. Intellectual humility. Picture this. You're in an argument, and evidence emerges that you're wrong. Do you acknowledge it and update your view? Or do you dig in, defend your position, and find reasons why the evidence doesn't count? Most people choose the second. The study of intellectual humility emerged in philosophy, but was formalized psychologically in the 2010s. Researchers defined it as recognizing the limits of your knowledge, being open to new information, and willingness to revise beliefs. Studies found it predicts better learning, wiser decision-making, and healthier relationships. A 2017 study from Pepperdine University found that people high in intellectual humility were better at distinguishing between strong and weak arguments, regardless of whether the argument supported their existing views. They could evaluate evidence on its merits, rather than filtering everything through confirmation bias. This works because certainty is comfortable but dangerous. When you're certain, you stop questioning, investigating, and learning. Intellectual humility keeps you epistemically open. Your beliefs remain tentative, subject to revision with better evidence. This isn't weakness, it's adaptability. You see this in science, where progress comes from questioning established theories. In politics, where the most dogmatic people learn the least. In personal growth, where people stuck in certainty about themselves never change. The truth is, the smartest thing you can say is, I don't know, or I might be wrong. Not as false modesty, but as genuine recognition that your understanding is always incomplete. But intellectual humility about beliefs is one thing. The next skill is about admitting mistakes. Apologizing effectively. What happens when you hurt someone, but your apology is, I'm sorry you feel that way, or I'm sorry, but you also? You think you've apologized, but you've actually made things worse. A bad apology is worse than no apology. The components of effective apology were studied by psychologist Stephen Shear in the 2000s. He identified 6 elements: expression of regret, explanation without excuse, acknowledgement of responsibility, declaration of repentance, offer of repair, and request for forgiveness. Apologies containing more elements were more effective at restoring trust. A 2016 study from Ohio State University tested different apology types. The most effective included acknowledgement of responsibility. It was my fault. An offer of repair. Here's how I'll fix it. Expressions of regret without responsibility. I'm sorry this happened. Were nearly worthless. People need to hear that you understand what you did wrong and won't repeat it. This works because apologies serve specific psychological functions. They acknowledge harm, validate the wronged person's feelings, and reduce the threat they pose going forward. A good apology says, I see what I did, I take responsibility, and I'll change. A bad apology says, I want you to stop being upset without me actually admitting fault. You see this in relationships that fail because neither person can truly apologize. In workplace conflicts that fester because of non-apology apologies. In public scandals where leaders apologize for getting caught, not for what they did. The truth is, apologizing well requires ego strength. You have to face your own failures honestly, which is uncomfortable. But that discomfort repairs relationships that defensiveness destroys. But apologizing is for when you're wrong. The next skill is for when you're right, but need to give critical feedback. Delivering constructive criticism. Imagine needing to tell someone their work isn't good enough, that they need to improve. You can be brutally direct, destroying their motivation. You can be so gentle they miss the message. Both approaches fail. There's a balance that few people find. The study of effective feedback was formalized in organizational psychology in the 1980s. Researchers found that feedback works best when it's specific, focused on behavior rather than character, delivered promptly, and balanced with acknowledgement of what's working. The feedback sandwich, praise, criticism, praise, became popular, though later research showed it can dilute the message. A 2014 Harvard Business Review study found that the most effective feedback answers 3 questions. What should the person start doing? What should they stop doing? What should they continue doing? This framework provides clear action steps rather than vague judgments. This works because the goal of criticism isn't to hurt or control. It's to improve performance. Criticism that attacks character, you're lazy, produces defensiveness. Criticism that identifies specific behaviors, you missed 3 deadlines this month, enables change. The person knows what to address. You see this in workplaces where some managers develop talent while others drive it away. In teaching, where constructive feedback helps students improve while harsh criticism makes them give up. In any relationship where growth requires honest assessment. The truth is, people can handle criticism if it's delivered with respect and genuine desire to help. What they can't handle is criticism that feels like attack or comes from a desire to dominate. But giving criticism is one skill. The next is about receiving it. Receiving feedback. Gracefully. Picture this. Someone gives you critical feedback, and your immediate internal response is defensiveness. They don't understand. That's not fair. They're being too harsh. You might not say it out loud, but your body language screams it. The opportunity to learn is lost. The ability to receive feedback was studied by Sheila Heen and Douglas Stone at Harvard in the 2010s. In their book, Thanks for the Feedback, they identified 3 types of feedback: appreciation, coaching, and evaluation. People often react poorly because they're receiving one type when they need another. But regardless of type, receiving feedback well is a learnable skill. Research shows that people who can receive feedback without defensiveness advance faster in careers, improve skills more rapidly, and maintain better relationships. A 2013 study found that simply pausing before responding to criticism, taking 3 deep breaths, reduced defensive reactions by 40%. This works because defensiveness is automatic, a threat response. Your ego feels attacked, and your brain prioritizes protecting self-image over learning. But feedback, even poorly delivered feedback, contains information. If you can separate the message from the delivery, you can extract value even from criticism that stings. You see this in high performers who actively seek feedback, understanding it's how they improve. In people who advance quickly because they don't waste energy defending, they just integrate and improve. In anyone who's learned that feedback is a gift, even when it doesn't feel like one. The truth is, you can't grow without feedback. And the better you receive it, the more people will give it to you, which accelerates development. But feedback is about performance. The next skill is about deeper self-awareness. Understanding your blind spots. What happens when everyone around you sees something about you, but you don't see it yourself? Maybe you interrupt constantly, or you're more negative than you realize, or you have a facial expression that makes you seem angry when you're just concentrating. These blind spots damage relationships and limit effectiveness, and by definition, you can't see them. The concept of blind spots was formalized by psychologists Joseph Luft and Harrington Ingham in 1955 with the Johari window model. They divided self-knowledge into 4 quadrants: what you and others know, what only you know, what only others know, and what nobody knows. Blind spots are what others know about you that you don't see yourself. Research on self-assessment consistently shows that people have limited self-awareness. A landmark 1999 study by Kruger and Dunning found that incompetent people dramatically overestimate their abilities. But even competent people have blind spots, aspects of their behavior or impact they simply don't perceive. This works because you experience yourself from the inside, aware of your intentions, your thoughts, your feelings. But others experience you from the outside, seeing only your behavior and its impact. You know you didn't mean to be dismissive, but they only see that you interrupted and talked over them. You see this in leaders who think they're approachable, but whose teams are terrified of them. In people who believe they're good listeners, but dominate every conversation. In anyone whose self-perception differs dramatically from how others experience them. The truth is, reducing blind spots requires actively seeking honest feedback and actually believing it. Your first response will be, "That's not true. I'm not like that." That's the blind spot talking. But understanding blind spots requires others' input. The next skill is about observation you can do yourself. Tracking patterns in your behavior. Imagine noticing that you always get sick after major deadlines, or that you pick fights with your partner every Sunday evening, or that you feel anxious specifically in meetings with certain people. These patterns are information, but most people never notice them. The practice of self-tracking, quantifying behaviors to identify patterns, gained prominence with the quantified self movement in the 2000s. While some focused on fitness metrics, psychologists recognized that tracking emotions, behaviors, and triggers revealed patterns invisible to casual introspection. A 2015 study on mood tracking found that people who logged their emotional states for just 2 weeks identified patterns they'd never noticed. They discovered that specific situations, people, or times of day consistently affected their mood. This awareness enabled them to modify situations or prepare better. This works because memory is unreliable and selective. You remember dramatic events, but forget the repetitive patterns that actually shape your life. But when you track, patterns emerge. You see that you're not randomly anxious. You're anxious every Tuesday, before team meetings. That's actionable information. You see this in therapy, where clients keep journals and discover patterns in their thoughts and behaviors. In productivity, where people track their time and discover they're most effective at certain hours. In health, where tracking reveals that your stomach problems correlate with specific foods, not random occurrence. The truth is, you're full of patterns, but they're invisible until you make them visible. A few weeks of tracking can reveal more about yourself than years of casual reflection. But tracking reveals patterns. The next skill is about breaking them. Breaking unhelpful habits. Picture this. You know you shouldn't check your phone first thing in the morning, but you do it anyway. You've decided to quit 100 times, yet the behavior persists. It's not that you lack willpower, it's that you're fighting habit the wrong way. The science of habit formation was revolutionized by MIT researcher Anne Graybiel in the 1990s. She discovered that habits live in the basal ganglia, a primitive brain region, not the prefrontal cortex, where conscious decisions happen. This means habits are automatic, not intentional. You can't just decide to stop them. In 2012, Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit, popularized the habit loop. Cue, routine, reward. The key insight: you can't eliminate a habit, you can only replace the routine while keeping the cue and reward. If your cue is stress and your routine is eating junk food, giving you the reward of comfort, you need a different routine that provides comfort. Removing the junk food without a replacement just creates suffering. This works because habits are efficient. Your brain creates automatic behaviors to conserve mental energy. Fighting them with willpower is exhausting and temporary. But if you understand the loop, you can reprogram it. You see this in smoking cessation programs that succeed by replacing the routine, not just removing cigarettes. In exercise habits that stick when tied to existing cues. In any behavior change that lasts because it worked with the brain's habit system, not against it. The truth is, most failed behavior change happens because people try to eliminate habits through willpower alone. That's fighting biology. Understanding how habits work makes change possible. But breaking bad habits is one thing. The next skill is about building good ones. Designing environment for success. What happens when you rely on motivation to exercise, but your gym clothes are in a hard-to-reach closet? Your gym is 30 minutes away, and your TV is right there? You fail, not because you're weak, but because your environment makes failure easy and success hard. The power of environment in shaping behavior was demonstrated repeatedly in behavioral psychology. In the 1970s, studies showed that Vietnam veterans who were heroin addicts in Vietnam had remarkably high recovery rates upon returning home, around 90%. much higher than typical addiction treatment. The key factor? Different environment. Their addiction was tied to cues in Vietnam. Back home, without those cues, the behavior didn't trigger. James Clear's 2018 book, Atomic Habits, popularized the concept of environment design. He argued that changing behavior isn't about changing yourself, it's about changing your environment. Make good behaviors obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying. Make bad behaviors invisible, unattractive, difficult, and unsatisfying. This works because behavior follows the path of least resistance. If healthy food is visible and prepared, you eat it. If junk food is hidden and inconvenient, you don't. Your willpower is limited, but environment is constant. Environment wins. You see this in grocery stores, which design environments to maximize purchases. In offices that increase collaboration by changing physical layout. In homes where families eat healthier simply by rearranging the kitchen. The truth is, you're not separate from your environment. You're constantly interacting with it, and it's constantly shaping you. Designing your environment is designing yourself, but environment shapes behavior. The next skill is about identity shaping behavior. Identity-based change. Imagine someone asks if you want a cigarette. If you say, "No thanks, I'm trying to quit," you're expressing a goal. But if you say, "No thanks, I don't smoke," you're expressing an identity. That distinction changes everything. The concept of identity-based behavior change was developed by psychologist James Clear in the 2010s, building on earlier self-perception theory. He argued that most people focus on outcomes. I want to lose 20 pounds, or processes. I'll go to the gym regularly. But the most powerful changes come from identity shifts. I'm a healthy person, or I'm an athlete. Research supports this. A 2012 study on voting behavior found that people asked, "Will you be a voter?" had higher turnout than those asked, "Will you vote?" The first question activated identity. The second just asked about behavior. Similarly, studies on exercise adherence show that people who identify as athletes maintain routines better than those who just have fitness goals. This works because behaviors that align with identity are self-reinforcing. When you see yourself as a reader, reading doesn't require discipline. It's just who you are. When you see yourself as someone who's trying to read more, every book is an obligation, and you'll quit when motivation fades. You see this in successful behavior change across domains. People who quit smoking successfully don't see themselves as smokers resisting temptation. They see themselves as non-smokers. People who transform their health don't diet temporarily. They become healthy people. The truth is, every action is a vote for the type of person you're becoming. Focus on identity, and behavior follows naturally. But identity is about who you are. The next skill is about who you're becoming. Embracing lifelong learning. Picture this. You finish school and think your learning is done. You've acquired the knowledge you need. Now it's time to apply it. But the world keeps changing, and within years, what you learned is obsolete. You're unprepared, not because you didn't learn, but because you stopped learning. The concept of lifelong learning became urgent in the late 20th century as technological change accelerated. Economist Alvin Toffler wrote in 1970, "The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn." This prophecy has proven accurate. Research from the World Economic Forum suggests that by 2025, 50% of all employees will need reskilling due to technological adoption. The half-life of skills, how long they remain relevant, has dropped from 30 years to 5 years in many fields. Learning is no longer a phase of life, it's a continuous requirement. This works because the world is changing faster than ever. Industries that didn't exist 10 years ago now employ millions. Skills that were cutting edge are now baseline. The only sustainable competitive advantage is the ability to learn faster than change happens. You see this in careers, where people who continuously learn advance while those relying on old knowledge plateau. In industries disrupted by technology, where those who adapted survived and those who didn't became obsolete. In any field where yesterday's expertise is today's baseline. The truth is, you're either learning or becoming irrelevant. There's no stable state anymore. And learning isn't just acquiring new information, it's cultivating the capacity to learn continuously. But lifelong learning is about skills and knowledge. The next skill is about learning about yourself. Seeking diverse perspectives. What happens when everyone you talk to agrees with you? It feels good, validating, safe. But you're not learning. You're not challenging your assumptions, and you're not discovering your blind spots. You're in an echo chamber, and it's making you less capable. The danger of homogeneous perspectives was demonstrated in Irving Janis's 1972 research on groupthink. He studied failed decisions, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Challenger disaster, and found that groups making these decisions shared similar backgrounds, perspectives, and assumptions. Dissenting voices were silenced or absent. The result was catastrophic decision-making. More recent research on diversity shows that teams with diverse perspectives outperform homogeneous teams on complex problems. A 2015 study found that diverse groups made better decisions, not because diversity is inherently good, but because it forces people to explain their reasoning, question assumptions, and consider alternatives they'd otherwise ignore. This works because your perspective is limited by your experience. If you've only lived one kind of life, known one kind of person, held one set of assumptions, you literally can't see alternatives. But exposure to different perspectives expands your cognitive range. You see this in innovation, which almost always comes from combining ideas from different domains. In problem solving, where diverse teams find solutions homogeneous teams miss. In personal growth, where people most transformed are those who actively seek perspectives different from their own. The truth is, surrounding yourself with people who think like you is comfortable but limiting. Growth happens at the edges, where your assumptions are challenged. But seeking diverse perspectives externally is one thing. The next skill is about generating diverse thoughts internally. Creative thinking. Imagine facing a problem, and you immediately jump to the obvious solution, the first thing that comes to mind. Everyone else does the same. The solution fails because the problem wasn't obvious, it was complex. You needed creativity, but you didn't know how to access it. The study of creativity was revolutionized in the 1960s by psychologist J.P. Guilford, who distinguished between convergent thinking, finding the one right answer, and divergent thinking, generating multiple possibilities. Schools emphasize convergent thinking, but most real-world problems require divergence first. Research on creative insight shows it often comes from unconscious processing. When you consciously focus on a problem, you engage established neural pathways, leading to conventional solutions. But when you step away, the default mode network activates, making unexpected connections. This explains why breakthroughs often happen in the shower or on walks. This works because creativity isn't magic. It's making novel connections between existing ideas. Your brain contains vast stores of information, but most combinations remain unexplored. Divergent thinking explores more combinations, increasing the chance of discovering useful novelty. You see this in innovation labs that use brainstorming techniques to generate ideas without immediate evaluation. In artists who produce volume, knowing that quantity generates quality. In anyone who's discovered that their best ideas come when they're not trying. The truth is, everyone is creative, but most people constrain creativity through premature judgment. The secret is separating generation from evaluation. First, produce many ideas without criticism. Then, evaluate. But creativity generates ideas. The next skill is about executing them. Project management basics. Picture this. You have a great idea. You start working on it with enthusiasm, but weeks later, you're lost. You've been busy, but haven't made real progress. There are pieces everywhere, but nothing's coming together. You needed a plan, but you thought plans were bureaucratic. The formalization of project management began in the 1950s with complex military and construction projects. Tools like Gantt charts, critical path analysis, and milestone tracking were developed to coordinate large teams. While these seem technical, the underlying principles apply to any goal-directed effort. Research on goal achievement shows that specific plans dramatically increase success rates. A 2001 study found that people who created implementation intentions, specific plans for when, where, and how they'd act, were 2 to 3 times more likely to achieve goals than those who just stated intentions. This works because complex projects have many components that must coordinate. Without planning, you forget things, waste effort, and lose track of progress. But with even basic project management, breaking work into tasks, setting deadlines, tracking completion, you maintain direction and momentum. You see this in people who accomplish large personal projects, writing books, renovating homes, while others talk about the same projects for years without progress. The difference isn't ability or time, it's having a systematic approach. The truth is, project management isn't bureaucracy, it's applied intelligence. It's thinking through a complex effort before beginning, anticipating problems, and creating structure that supports completion. But project management is about tasks. The next skill is about the most important project, yourself. Personal financial literacy. What happens when you earn money but don't understand it? You spend impulsively, save randomly, invest naively, and end up financially stressed despite adequate income. You were never taught that financial literacy is as important as reading literacy. The importance of financial education was highlighted dramatically by the 2008 financial crisis. Studies afterward found that people with lower financial literacy were more likely to have subprime mortgages, credit card debt, and inadequate retirement savings. A 2015 study by the FINRA Foundation found that only 37% of Americans could correctly answer 4 out of 5 basic financial literacy questions. Research on financial behavior shows that simple knowledge makes enormous difference. Understanding compound interest, the time value of money, and basic investing principles enables people to build wealth that others with identical incomes never achieve. A 2013 study found that financial literacy training increased savings rates by 20% within a year. This works because money is a tool, and tools work better when you understand them. You don't need to be a financial genius. You need to understand basics. Spend less than you earn. Save systematically. Understand debt costs. Invest for long-term growth, and protect against major risks. You see this in people with modest incomes who retire comfortably because they understood compound interest and started saving early. Conversely, people earning 6 figures living paycheck to paycheck because they never learned to manage money. The truth is, Schools don't teach financial literacy, so you must teach yourself. The cost of ignorance, decades of financial stress, is too high to accept. But financial literacy is about money. The next skill is about something money can't buy. Building and maintaining friendships. Imagine being in your 30s or 40s and realizing you don't have close friends anymore. You have acquaintances, people you see occasionally, but no one you truly connect with. You got busy with work and family, friendships faded, and you didn't notice until the loneliness became overwhelming. The importance of friendship for well-being was demonstrated dramatically by the Harvard study of adult development, which followed people for over 80 years starting in 1938. The clearest finding: quality relationships predicted health, happiness, and longevity better than wealth, career success, or any other factor. People with strong friendships lived longer and happier lives. But friendship requires maintenance. Research by psychologist Robin Dunbar suggests that friendships decay without contact. Close friendships require interaction every few weeks to maintain intimacy. Without it, people drift from close friends to casual acquaintances within months. This works because friendships aren't static, they're dynamic. They exist in interaction, not in memory. You might fondly remember a friend from college, but if you haven't spoken in years, the friendship is gone. It exists as nostalgia, not as a living relationship. You see this in people who wake up at midlife, realizing they're isolated. Work consumed their time, friendships seemed expendable. And by the time they noticed, the friendships had dissolved. Rebuilding is harder than maintaining. The truth is, friendships are relationships, and relationships require tending. You have to reach out, make time, show up. Not because it's obligatory, but because connection is fundamental to human well-being. But friendship is one type of relationship. The next addresses another crucial one: navigating romantic relationships. Picture this. You're in a relationship and you know something's wrong, but you can't articulate it. There's distance, resentment, the spark has faded. You tell yourself it's normal, that all relationships become like this, but you wonder if there's something you're missing. The scientific study of romantic relationships accelerated in the 1980s with psychologist John Gottman's research. He observed couples in his love lab, recording their interactions and following them for years. From thousands of hours of observation, he identified patterns that predicted divorce with over 90% accuracy. The most toxic patterns he called the Four Horsemen: criticism, attacking character rather than addressing behavior; contempt, treating partner with disrespect; defensiveness, refusing to take responsibility; and stonewalling, withdrawing and refusing to engage. Couples exhibiting these patterns regularly were almost certain to divorce. But he also identified what successful relationships do. They maintain a 5.1 ratio of positive to negative interactions. They turn toward bids for connection rather than away. They accept influence from each other. And they repair conflicts quickly rather than letting resentment build. This works because romantic relationships aren't sustained by initial attraction or compatibility alone. They're sustained by how you navigate conflict, make bids for connection, and maintain respect. Skills determine longevity more than feelings. You see this in couples who remain deeply connected for decades, while others with seemingly better matches divorce. The difference isn't who they chose, it's how they relate. Strong relationships are built, not found. The truth is, relationship success isn't mysterious. Research has identified what works and what doesn't. But most people never learn these skills. assuming love should be effortless. But romantic relationships are one domain. The next skill applies across all relationships. Conflict resolution. What happens when disagreement arises and you immediately try to win? You marshal arguments, point out flaws in the other person's position, and prove you're right. You win the argument, but you damage the relationship. You confused conflict with combat. The study of conflict resolution was formalized in the 1980s by researchers like Roger Fisher and William Ury. Their book, Getting to Yes, introduced principled negotiation. Separate people from problems. Focus on interests rather than positions. Generate options for mutual gain. And use objective criteria. Research on conflict shows that win-lose approaches, where one person prevails, damage relationships over time. The loser harbors resentment, compliance is grudging, and future conflicts are more intense. But win-win approaches, where both parties' core needs are addressed, strengthen relationships and produce stable agreements. This works because most conflicts aren't zero-sum. Beneath contradictory positions, I want A versus I want B, lie compatible interests. You both want respect, fairness, security. When you address interests rather than fighting over positions, creative solutions emerge. You see this in negotiations that produce deals both sides genuinely support, in families that resolve disputes without lasting damage, in workplaces where disagreement leads to better decisions rather than division. The truth is, avoiding conflict doesn't preserve relationships. Skillful engagement with conflict does. Healthy relationships have conflicts. They just handle them constructively. But conflict resolution is about disagreements. The next skill is about something deeper. Forgiving and moving forward. Imagine carrying grudges from years ago, replaying old hurts, maintaining walls around your heart. You think you're protecting yourself, but you're actually trapped. The person who wronged you has moved on, but you're still imprisoned by the past. The psychology of forgiveness was studied extensively in the 1990s by researchers like Everett Worthington and Robert Enright. They found that forgiveness, defined as releasing resentment toward an offender, produced measurable health benefits, reduced anxiety and depression, lower blood pressure, improved cardiovascular health. Importantly, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, excusing, or reconciling. You can forgive someone while maintaining boundaries. You can release resentment without pretending the offense didn't happen. Forgiveness is for you, not for them. This works because holding grudges is physiologically stressful. When you rehearse past wrongs, your body produces stress hormones. Over time, chronic resentment damages your health. Forgiveness releases this burden, allowing your nervous system to calm. You see this in people who spend years angry about past betrayals, the anger consuming their present life. Conversely, people who've experienced terrible wrongs but chose forgiveness report feeling lighter, freer, able to move forward. The truth is, forgiveness isn't weakness or naivety. It's releasing yourself from a prison of your own making. The past can't be changed, but your relationship to it can. But forgiveness is about past hurts. The next skill is about present moments. Being present. Picture this. You're eating dinner, but you're not tasting the food. You're reviewing the day, planning tomorrow, worrying about a conversation. Your body is at dinner, but you're nowhere. This happens constantly, and you're missing your life. The importance of present moment awareness was highlighted by psychologist Ellen Langer's research on mindfulness in the 1970s. She found that people who were more present, actively noticing their environment and experience, showed better memory, learning, and even physical health compared to those operating on autopilot. More dramatic evidence came from a 2010 Harvard study tracking people's moment-to-moment experiences via smartphone. They found that people's minds wandered 47% of the time, and that mind wandering made them unhappy, regardless of what they were doing. People were happier when fully engaged with even unpleasant activities than when distracted during pleasant ones. This works because life only happens in the present. The past is memory. The future is imagination. Everything you actually experience occurs now. Yet most people spend minimal time actually present, lost in mental time travel. You see this in people who eat without tasting, talk without listening, exist without experiencing. They reach the end of their lives wondering where it went. But people who cultivate presence report life feeling richer, longer, more vivid. The truth is, you can't be present all the time. Minds wander naturally. But you can notice when you've drifted and return. That return, practiced repeatedly, changes everything. But being present is about awareness. The next skill is about action grounded in that awareness. Taking calculated risks. What happens when opportunity appears, but fear holds you back? You analyze all the ways it could fail. Imagine every negative outcome and decide it's not worth the risk. You play it safe, and years later, you regret not trying. The psychology of risk-taking was studied extensively in the 1970s by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They found that people are loss-averse. The pain of losing something weighs roughly twice as much as the pleasure of gaining something equivalent. This means people avoid risks even when odds favor taking them. Research on regret shows a surprising pattern. In the short term, people regret actions they took that failed. But long term, people overwhelmingly regret inactions, the opportunities they didn't pursue. A 2018 study found that 76% of major life regrets involved things people didn't do, not things they did. This works because failed actions provide closure and learning. You tried, it didn't work, you know the answer. But inaction leaves permanent uncertainty, a lifetime of what if. The risk of regret from not trying often exceeds the risk of failure. You see this in people who stayed in safe but unfulfilling careers versus those who pursued meaningful but uncertain paths. The second group reports higher life satisfaction even when they failed because they tried. The first group wonders what might have been. The truth is, calculated risk isn't recklessness. You assess potential outcomes, prepare what you can, and accept uncertainty. Perfect safety isn't possible, and pursuing it guarantees missing opportunities. But taking risks requires handling their outcomes. The next skill addresses that. Learning from failure. Imagine failing at something important and concluding you're a failure. One event becomes your identity. You avoid similar situations in the future, limiting your life to protect your ego. This response to failure is common, and it's completely backwards. The reframe of failure as learning was popularized by Thomas Edison, who famously said about his attempts to create the light bulb, "I didn't fail. I just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Modern research on growth mindset by Carol Dweck in the 2000s showed this attitude is teachable and dramatically affects achievement. Studies on successful entrepreneurs found that most had multiple failed ventures before success. But they treated failure as data, not as personal inadequacy. They extracted lessons, adjusted strategies, and tried again. Their persistence wasn't blind. It was informed by learning from failure. This works because failure only provides information if you examine it. What specifically went wrong? What was in your control? What would you change next time? Without this analysis, failure is just pain. With it, failure becomes education. You see this in organizations with blameless postmortems after failures, where the goal is learning, not punishment. In scientists whose experiments fail far more often than they succeed, but each failure narrows possibilities. In anyone who's achieved something difficult by learning from many previous attempts. The truth is, the people who seem naturally successful have usually failed more than others tried. They just didn't let failure stop them. They let it teach them. But learning from failure is one thing. The next skill is about building on success. Recognizing and celebrating progress. Picture this. You set a goal, work toward it for months, make significant progress, but you don't feel satisfied. You immediately focus on what's left, what you haven't achieved, dismissing your progress as insufficient. You're moving forward, but never feeling forward motion. The importance of recognizing progress was highlighted by Harvard researcher Teresa Amabile in her 2011 book, The Progress Principle. Analyzing thousands of work diary entries, she found that the single greatest motivator was experiencing progress in meaningful work. Even small wins, when recognized, maintained motivation through long projects. Research on goal pursuit shows that people who track and celebrate incremental progress are more likely to achieve long-term goals. A 2015 study found that dieters who celebrated weekly progress, even 1 pound lost, maintained motivation longer than those only focused on final weight goals. This works because humans need feedback loops. When you only measure final outcomes, you operate without reinforcement for months or years. Your brain's reward system needs regular signals that you're moving in the right direction. Recognizing progress provides that signal. You see this in people who abandon ambitious goals not because they're failing, but because they don't recognize they're succeeding. They're improving, but their focus on the gap between current and ideal makes progress invisible. Meanwhile, people who celebrate small wins maintain momentum. The truth is, progress isn't just a step toward goals. It's a psychological need. You need to see that your efforts matter, that you're moving forward. Taking time to recognize progress isn't self-indulgent. It's strategic. But recognizing your progress is internal. The next skill is about expressing something outward. Practicing gratitude. What happens when you focus only on what's wrong, what's missing, what's not working? Your brain develops a negativity bias, constantly scanning for problems. Even when things are good, you can't enjoy them because you're anticipating what will go wrong. You're training yourself for unhappiness. The scientific study of gratitude was pioneered by Robert Emmons in the early 2000s. His research showed that people who kept gratitude journals, writing down 3 things they were grateful for each day, experienced measurable benefits: increased happiness, better sleep, stronger immune function, and more satisfying relationships. A landmark 2003 study compared 3 groups. One wrote about daily hassles, one about neutral events, and one about things they were grateful for. After 10 weeks, the gratitude group reported 25% higher happiness levels and significantly better physical health, including fewer doctor visits. This works because attention is selective. Your brain can focus on what's present or what's absent, what's working or what's broken. Gratitude practice trains your attention toward the positive without denying the negative. You're not pretending problems don't exist. You're balancing your awareness. You see this in people who have little but appreciate everything versus those who have much but appreciate nothing. The difference isn't circumstances, it's attention. Grateful people aren't delusional. They're intentional about what they focus on. The truth is, there's always something to appreciate and something to complain about. Gratitude is a choice about where you direct your attention, and that choice shapes your experience of life. But gratitude is about appreciation. The next skill is about contribution. Developing generosity. Imagine believing that holding tight to what you have keeps you safe, that giving means losing. That generosity is something you'll practice when you have more. This scarcity mindset keeps you trapped, ironically making you poorer than generosity ever would. The psychology of generosity was studied extensively in the 2000s, revealing counterintuitive findings. Research by Elizabeth Dunn showed that spending money on others produced more happiness than spending on oneself. In one study, participants given money were randomly assigned to spend it on themselves or others. Those who spent on others reported greater happiness that evening. Further research showed that generous people, those who gave time, money, or help regularly, reported better mental and physical health. A 2013 study found that older adults who volunteered regularly had lower mortality rates, even after controlling for health status. Generosity literally extended life. This works because humans are social species. We're wired for reciprocity and cooperation. When you give, you're signaling abundance, reinforcing your identity as someone with resources to share. This creates psychological benefits that receiving never does. You see this in communities where generosity flows freely, where people help each other without keeping score. These communities are stronger, happier, more resilient than those where everyone hoards. You see it in individuals who give even from scarcity and somehow never lack. The truth is, generosity isn't losing, it's investing. Not in financial return, but in connection, meaning, and your own sense of abundance. The more you give, the wealthier you feel. But generosity to others is one thing. The final skill brings everything full circle.